stand again. And so she wanted that known. And very important in this article is that a workman on site said, you know, her name could be, it's Julia Morgan, but it might as well be John Morgan. And so that's vital, right? Again, none of this is about being the graduate from the école. Because she was able to talk in the language that all of the builders needed to understand how to reconstruct this thing, they needed the engineering knowledge. They needed to know that she could talk about the technical side of things. They needed somebody who was competent in construction management, who could take care of all of the change orders, who could deal with the labor strife. She weathered it all. And so she won the respect of all these men in the different building trades related to architecture. And finally, this newspaper article was republished in the Architect and Engineer. So her fellow architects began to acknowledge her as well. Now, at the same time that she was working on the Fairmont Hotel, the Law brothers who owned the hotel, they commissioned her to design a new warehouse and office building for their company, which was the Viavi company. Strange company. If you're ever looking for a history project, for those of you history people out there, the Viavi system's a little bit strange. Anyway, so they hired Morgan, and this article here is actually the first article about a Julia Morgan designed building to appear in the Architect and Engineer. And it's all about how it is a strong fireproof building and it's indestructible. And I think the vaults actually still might be there. It's part of the site is now the Ritz Hotel, I think it is. So I think they might be there. Anyway, but Morgan's name isn't here. So much like nobody mentioned the name of Julia Morgan while the Fairmont Hotel was being reconstructed, the Law brothers did not mention the architect who was designing their fabulous new warehouse. But again, Julia Morgan's work was making the Architect and Engineer. And that building, it also made concrete and constructional engineering. It made a national circulation. In this article too, Julia Morgan's name wasn't mentioned. Again, like, I don't know, maybe they're a bit wary about mentioning that a woman designed this very notable reinforced concrete building. And one thing that was really pointed out in the article about the Viavi building is that it combined this modern technology with these elegant aesthetics. They called it Spanish. It really looks a lot more sort of Italianate to me, but whatever, it's definitely got some aesthetics to it, and that was noted. And then it made the Sunset magazine. So both of the Fairmont Hotel and the Viavi building made Sunset magazine. So now, and Julia Morgan's name was attached to the Viavi building. And so she got statewide recognition for her work related to this very impressive reinforced concrete building. So all of that. Oh yeah, and then Lewis Hicks, this is the other thing. So Lewis Hicks, remember, she worked with Lewis Hicks on the Greek theater. He was in charge of, he poured the concrete. And so he had worked very closely with Julia Morgan all year, building the Greek theater, that massive concrete building. And then what I discovered is that after the earthquake and fires, he put his office, like I said, only part of the Fairmont Hotel was destroyed and a significant part of it wasn't. And so people flooded into the part that was okay to have their offices. And Lewis Hicks was one of them. And so, and he was in construction, you know. And so my theory, and I can't actually substantiate it, is that Lewis Hicks heard Stanford White had died and they needed an architect who was willing and competent enough to take on the Fairmont Hotel. He had worked with Julia Morgan, which was also something of a debacle of a project, a total nightmare. And she got through that. And so my theory is that he put in a good word about Julia Morgan being the right person for the Fairmont Hotel. And he also hired her to build a house for him, which as a reinforced concrete house. And so again, she was pushing the boundaries of what you could do with the most modern construction technologies. So up to now, I've been trying to convey to you just how important engineering was to establishing Julia Morgan's reputation and career. Again, she had people waiting for her to design their houses, but she had to prove herself way beyond her education for architects, engineers, laborers, builders, all of the men, to gain their respect, to really thrive in the architectural profession, which she did through all of those early projects. She's maintained a love for engineering throughout her career, and again, tried to push the boundaries when she could. This is the chapel at Asilomar, which is in Pacific Grove. And generally, Asilomar is recognized as one of the largest collections of the Bay tradition style, that regional variation on the arts and crafts that's notable for its interior and exterior use of wood, redwood especially, and then riverstone and no applied ornamentation, exposed structural elements, etc. So it's might be classed as sort of an anti-modern. Some people would class it as proto-modernist, which I would, and others would classify it as anti-modern because it looks like you're in the woods. Either way, that window there, it's a replacement, but the original one was still, it was plate glass. And Morgan, she changed the plans at the last minute because new technologies allowed for even larger plate glass windows. And so she changed the specs so that she could put in the largest glass window possible in the chapel. And this looked right out onto the dunes and the trees. And so you had this gigantic natural picture to look out on at the chapel. And this is the same time that like Willis Polk was designing the Halliday building in San Francisco, which is the first multi-story building to have a glass curtain wall in the front. And then finally, this is the Berkeley City Club, which was completed in 1929, 1930. And so it's getting later in Julia Morgan's career. And her longtime structural engineer, Walter Stylberg, he was the person who did all of the engineering calculations for this building. And he commented in 1974, 1975, when he was about 85 years old, and he had a very long and distinguished career. He had developed a number of patents. He had overseen the first earthquake retrofitting of the stadium at UC Berkeley, which stands on top of a fault. So he knew what he was talking about when it came to engineering. And he claimed at the time, and I don't know enough, but I'm going to take him for his word, that the Berkeley City Club was probably the most complex reinforced concrete building in the entire state of California. Now, that could possibly be because the whole thing is concrete. Almost all of the ceilings, the walls, it's all concrete with an enormous amount of Gothic detail. And so there's an artisanal quality to the building that's kind of unprecedented in other reinforced concrete buildings. Maybe that's one of the reasons, but it probably has more to do with the engineering and the physics. And I'm not going to talk too much about it because I would start to sound very stupid very quickly, but it's a lot of intersecting planes. It was difficult for earthquake, for shear, for all this stuff. And it's not just intersecting planes, it's intersecting planes that are filled with soft stories. It's multiple cavernous soft stories that were intersecting. And at the bottom of one of them, along the whole side of the building, the base of the building, was the pool. And I mean, until like 10 years ago, actually, the pool didn't have adequate ventilation. And so the water was getting into the windows and then creeping into the walls and deteriorating the concrete and the rebar and such like. But just an extraordinary complex building. Now, of course, by this time, by 1930, Julia Morgan wasn't making any calculations. She didn't have to. She didn't have the knowledge anymore to be able to make the calculations. And so she relied on Walter Stylberg and other people with more modern engineering qualifications to do all of that work. But she still had that engineer's mind, and she knew that the building could work because she understood the basics. She understood physics. And again, she was really pushing the boundaries on the aesthetic nature of concrete, on the beauty of it, the intersecting planes, and she loved the plasticity of it. All right, I think that's it for engineering. All right, the client's architect. Okay, let's just look through some styles. If you just look at some of the projects that Julia Morgan designed for William Randolph Hearst, you get a sense of the breadth of styles that she could work in. Here you have the LA Examiner building that's in sort of an over-the-top eclectic Spanish colonial Baroque revival style with very Baroque interiors, over the top in a pretty common Hearstian way. The Marion Davies house, the beach house in Santa Monica, now the Annenberg beach house, was basically a Georgian building. I do recommend visiting. Most of the building's gone. Houses is still there, and there's some fantastic tiles in the bathrooms. It's not generally my cup of tea, this house, but some of the tiles are spectacular. Anyway, it's pretty much Georgian style. Then you have the Bavarian village up in Shasta County along the McCloud River called Wintoon. And of course you have Hearst Castle nearby you in San Simeon. And at Hearst Castle, you have a hodgepodge of styles. You get some Egyptian, combined with Spanish, and you do a little Romanesque with Byzantine, and then maybe a bit of Venetian, and not just like Greek revival, but actually Greek, right? That's the remnants of a Greek temple, combined with some French, new French Carrara marble statuary. Now, if anybody embodied the client, if epitomizes that Morgan was a client's architect, it was William Randolph Hearst. She commented that this wasn't her favorite commission. I think it was an extraordinary opportunity. It allowed her to hire so many people, so many artisans, work with so many different amazing artifacts. It was amazing. But the whole thing was a little bit less than a sort of coherent design that pleased her. She preferred the Berkeley City Club, which was designed around the same time. But it was her client's choice. So she did what her client wanted. Now, for ever, basically, this idea, this knowledge that Morgan was really a client's architect has been used against her. As she wasn't that much of an architect. She didn't have her own theory. She didn't have her own style, and that's been a hit against her. But I actually like to turn that on its face, and it's one on its head. And it's one of the most important things about understanding the significance of her career. And we're just going to look at a few examples. So a house that she designed for two doctors, Elsie Lee Mitchell and Clara Williams, who are dressed in uniform here because they were on a mission to Armenia after the genocide in 1919. And they went to help the families there who had survived. But they commissioned Julia Morgan to design a house in 1916. And it's a little bungalow. It's a Bay tradition style bungalow with the wood shingle exteriors and some leaded glass, a little bit of stained glass, no applied ornamentation, again, in that proto-modernist way. The natural beauty and the structure itself serving as decoration. There were, anti-commercialism elements to the Bay tradition style, extensive use of built-in so that you didn't have to buy bookshelves. Again, you have you have the exposed structural elements typical of the Bay tradition style. And this is one of the simplest fireplaces I've seen. So Charles Keeler, he is recognized as, and along with Bernard Maybeck, they're recognized as really proliferating the popularity of the Bay tradition style. But in fact, it originated, Bernard Maybeck designed it first, but it was women's clubs who actually latched on to the style, and they began circulating publications. And that's important because, you know, nature isn't really that, well, so it's important. So if you think of the Bay tradition style as like bringing the mountains to the city, and then understanding what it was like for women in California to go out to the mountains, you cannot read a memoir from the time where women don't talk about the freedom, the liberation they felt when they were in the mountains. So you have the early 19th century painting of the men in the Hudson River Valley with sort of the beauty of the nature there and the light of God sort of being all powerful, versus the women in California at Glacier Peak or Glacier Point at Yosemite, like on top of the world, dancing on a cliff, like conquering nature. And they could pull their skirts up, they could wear comfortable shoes. There was a separation of duties at the campsite, but women's work was equally valued as the men's work. So nature was so important to women, and they brought it home in those Bay tradition houses and other buildings. You can see here, again, this was not universal across the country. Elsie DeWolf was a designer, very popular. She also worked a lot with nature, but it was more about chintz and rococo and wallpaper with floral components, versus the Arthur DeWint house, it's the North Star house, and it's Mary Halleck Foote actually who paid for it, which and she was a important writer at the time. And it's a very different aesthetic that the women were bringing home to California with the Bay tradition style. So you have a redefinition of femininity, if you will. So that's one thing about the Mitchell house, but it's really about the function of the house that's so important. You have here, this is a garage, and here, this is a front hall with an office. And this house, you have this complete division of space between work and home. But the garage itself, it's an attached garage. This was highly unusual at the time because engines and cars were combustible, and your house could burn down very easily if you had an attached garage. But doctors, if people were going to have attached garages, doctors were most likely to, because they needed access to their cars quickly so that they could go and visit clients whenever help was needed. And so there's the garage. So this house literally helps the women in their careers as doctors, right? That's one way work and home combined and actually facilitated greater independence and career building. Then here, interestingly, this is pretty much the most open plan that I've seen in a Morgan house. And it may just be that the site required that. It's a relatively small site that's very steep. So maybe there wasn't that much space to be able to carve it up. But even here, this was just an archway between the living room and the dining room with no doors, which is unusual. And so it's a very modern open plan. Then you go downstairs, and it's even more interesting. In the guest rooms, you have this guest room here. You have, and this guest room here, you have sinks. And that makes sense for doctors, right? Hygiene being of significant importance. So that's great, but it's also very private. It allowed guests to get ready for bed in the privacy of the rooms. They didn't have to go to the bathroom and the wash chamber. And that's a nice perk. But then you look here at bedroom 1 and bedroom 2, and these bedrooms are connected by another bathroom and the changing room, the closet. And this is a very intimate space for two people to share. And so what this was doing was allowing Clara Williams and Elsie Mitchell to be lesbians in the privacy of their own home in the early 20th century. So, you know, residential architecture isn't always thought of as that interesting. But it was so important here. And this is only one example where Julia Morgan was helping women design spaces to advance their personal and professional needs. And in this case, their sexual orientation as well. And before anybody asks, it's a very popular question these days, was Julia Morgan a lesbian? There's not enough evidence to say that she was or wasn't. Frankly, she worked all the time and didn't have any time for intimate personal relationships like that. And she also did an enormous amount for her family. So maybe she was, but the evidence doesn't necessarily show it. You have to theorize your way to it. So I don't. Okay. Also on the theory of function, or the theme of function. In 1899, Bernard Maybeck designed Hearst Hall for Phoebe Hearst, William Randolph Hearst's mother. It was designed as an exhibition space during the international competition for the design of the new University of California campus. And it was intended to become a space for the women students and a gymnasium for them after the competition was completed, which happened. So for a couple of decades, this was the women's gymnasium. And then in 1922, it burned down. And William Randolph Hearst hired Bernard Maybeck to design a new gymnasium. It was a natural thing to do. Bernard had been the first architect. He had been a beloved architect of Phoebe Hearst. And so it was perfectly logical. And Bernard Maybeck, he supplied this design, this plan to Hearst. And Hearst responded to it. And among other things, it says, well, I don't know, I guess it's all right as far as things go, but it kind of reminds me of pleurisy, which is not really sort of the healthy and vibrant vibe you want to get from a gymnasium, you know? But the woman who was in charge of women's athletics and women's programs at Berkeley at the time said, whatever, the building doesn't function. It doesn't meet any of our needs. Our women, they are sophisticated. They need classrooms. They need meeting rooms. They socialize. They want to swim. They need lockers by the changing rooms. Like this building doesn't function. At which point, William Randolph Hearst called his favorite architect, Julia Morgan, to come help. Now, by this time, it's like 1926. By this time, Julia had over 2 decades of experience working with women's institutions and designing spaces for the 20th century woman, and designing very spaces with complex programmatic needs, like all of those YWCAs. So this is what she came up with. And here again, you get that like precision in her design. So her design has like 5 gyms in it, and it has doors that can open and close so you can create more gym space. It had 3 swimming pools. It has a kitchen and social spaces, and it has offices for the women in the administration and faculty. It has locker rooms and showers. And so it really reflects how she understood what modern women needed, again, in the 20th century. So Bernard Maybeck, in the end, it was a collaboration between Maybeck and Morgan, and kind of the romanticism about the pool is more of a reflection of Maybeck. But the function and the needs that it filled, that's all Morgan. And thanks to her, it's still one of the most popular swimming holes in Berkeley. And then finally, the Chinatown YWCA. So this was the fourth building that Morgan designed for the Chinese community, or the third. She designed Gum Moon, the Methodist Chinese mission. Fourth. In 1909, she designed a house for Joseph Shung, who founded the National Dollar Stores and was the wealthiest Chinese American in the country at the time. She designed what is now the Julia Morgan School for Girls at Mills College, and it was the Ming Kwong Home for Girls. And then she designed the Chinatown YWCA. And what makes this building stand out is that Morgan worked with an almost exclusively Chinese American building committee. So this building reflects the needs of that particular ethnic group. So how did they want to express themselves in the built environment? They took great pride in Chinese culture. It abounds in the color scheme, in architectural references to the pagoda roof and the upturned ends, the finial, the punched concrete vents that have there the dragon staircase. It also of a dragon's tail, but then you also have the screen, the Chinese screen motif, and you have again very important colors, a simple color scheme, but a vitally important color scheme to Chinese culture with the gold, the red, the green. Again, the dragon was everywhere, plus you have the Chinese lanterns. Again, you have the screen, and you have the koi pond in the peace garden, and the food dogs overlooking the peace garden as well. So the building committee, they very much wanted to express the Chinese culture. And then they also wanted a gymnasium. In fact, the gymnasium dominates the facade. The gymnasium was the single most important aspect to this building for the building committee. Morgan had to come back to the central board of the San Francisco YWCA and said, look, they need a gymnasium. If they're going to have any classrooms, we need more money. And the women, they'd raised a lot of money, but they would need more money. And the money was granted, but it was of utmost importance that they had a gymnasium. Now, if you think of the metaphor of bound feet, like Judy Young's book, Unbound Feet, it's the whole process of how Chinese women came over in the middle of the 19th century and were still stuck. You know, they're not always, I don't want to overgeneralize, but they found themselves placed in prostitution and with bound feet, and they couldn't move. It was painful. And over the course of time, as they gained independence and opportunity, their feet were unbound. Like, that's the metaphor she uses. And nothing evokes that more than the gymnasium. And the gymnasium is very American. So what you have in the Chinatown YWCA is very much an expression of Chinese American identity. And so, you know, to credit Morgan for being the client's architect is important, because if you think about it, her career was tied intimately to the California women's movement. It depended on her and she depended on it. In this rather amateurish chart here, I connected 80 women for whom Julia Morgan designed houses through the almost exclusively women's clubs that they were involved with. I also included the Sierra Club because so many of them were in it, and it's one of the only organizations that men allowed women to join. But so think about how Julia Morgan, being their architect, was empowering all of these women to create incredibly diverse lives and opportunities for themselves throughout the early 20th century. And I think that's it. So I will stop sharing and answer any questions.
Okay. Round of applause. Thank you, Karen. Ellen, do you want me to field the questions or? Yeah, okay. Karen, that was a really wonderful window into the life and practice of Julia Morgan. And you touched on a lot of the projects that we have the original drawings in the exhibition too. So it's really great to like contextualize them in a way we can't in the exhibition. So thank you. Let's see, maybe an easy one, short answer question. Did Julia Morgan and Southwestern architect Mary Coulter know each other? They were about the same age, practicing at the same time.
Right. To my knowledge, they didn't. I would assume that they knew of each other, but I've never seen any correspondence between them or any reference by either of them towards the other. But there are connections to other important architects. Lillian Rice, who I always get them mixed up. Lillian Rice either designed Rancho Santa Fe or she was really important in Santa Barbara. I forget. But she was an architecture student in 1908-09 at Berkeley when the senior women's building was being designed. And she worked directly with Morgan and then even tried to, I don't think she ever worked in her office, but she knew Morgan. And some other women architects did too.
Great, thank you. We had a question, let's see, some questions are coming up in the Q&A and some in the chat. We have a question about how Morgan kept her sanity working for Hearst. She often visited the site on weekends, but she made many, many visits. So, and it went on for decades. So what are your thoughts on that?
Her stamina, period, is just unbelievable. It's not simply that she was visiting Hearst Castle on the weekends. She would get on the train and go to Hearst Castle. And this is like at the height of all these YWCAs and things during the 1920s. Get on the train, go to Hearst Castle on the weekend, then continue to Southern California and monitor the construction of all these YWCAs and maybe Marion Davies Beach House, etc. Come back up the coast, go back to Hearst Castle, and then go back to San Francisco. It's an unbelievable schedule. So the thing is with Hearst is that I think she just adored him. He adored her and he adored him. She adored him and he adored her. It doesn't take reading too much correspondence to see how they were two peas in a pod who could talk about architecture ad nauseum. They wrote back all the time. They just lived it and breathed it. He probably lived and breathed a lot of other things too, but when he was focused on the architecture, they were just two peas in a pod. He was just bigger than life and she was very retiring. So they had that kind of opposite personality, but she loved to problem solve. So and then she stood up to him as well. He respected her. And that's another really important thing to this relationship is as many headaches as he might have caused, and he did because he asked for all these changes and he didn't pay his bills. But he respected her so that when a contractor, the plumber, whose name is escaping me right now, but the plumber wasn't getting paid. And he said, look, I can't afford this anymore. I've had to take out loans. You've got to get Mr. Hearst to pay me or I'm going to have to leave the project. It was the 1920s. There was building everywhere in California. He didn't need it and it was a headache. So the next week he was paid because Morgan went to Hearst and said, you've got to pay your bills, and Hearst listened. And so that respect was also really important and probably, did a lot of good towards keeping the relationship healthy, even though he wanted oak trees moved and pools rebuilt and such like.
Yeah, and I actually myself have a related question about that relationship in the design process at Hearst Castle, which is, we know that starting with the École that Morgan did these stylistic mashups, as you mentioned, and so there's already evidence of that, but do you think that was just as much Morgan as Hearst with this desire to just take all these different styles and fragments from all over the world and incorporate them?
Yeah, because in the end, there are very few examples in Julia Morgan's entire oeuvre where she was a purist. You just find very few examples of, like, if you look at San Francisco City Hall, it's like Les Invalides in San Francisco. The references are just almost one-to-one. And you rarely find that kind of allegiance to any sort of historical precedent or style or anything in all of Morgan's work. And in her own buildings, like, you know, she lived in a Victorian in San Francisco. She bought 2 of them and she just lopped off the second floor of one because she needed light. So I think that
that was another question. So you just answered that question. Morgan cut off the second story of one side of her home. Why did she do that? Okay. She needed more light.
Yeah, she needed more light for the apartment building. So she had these 2 buildings. One of them was an apartment building. They needed more natural light in there. And she was using the second one for herself and didn't need 2 stories. I don't think she was much of a you know, she didn't like domestic stuff. So, so she lopped it off and then she built a garage.
Right. Oh, and there is a suggestion that Alex Rankin was the plumber.
Yeah. It is Rankin.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. So I have a question about your where your research is in the context of feminist theory. And then it says specifically your assessment of Morgan's role within Bay Area intelligentsia, clients from progressive women's organizations, early members and founders of the Sierra Club and UC faculty. And you started to touch on that with your genealogy of, you know, context and all of that. But did you want to add anything?
So in terms of where I place Morgan in feminist theory, it's really in feminism as action. She was not a person who she wouldn't ever call herself a feminist, but she actually was called a feminist at the time, especially when she was in France. She was specifically noted as part of the feminist movement. And it's actually French feminism that I find to be a lot more useful in terms of understanding Morgan, because there's more of a spectrum. French feminist theory has more of a spectrum from conservative feminists to liberal and radical feminists. And whereas in this country, feminism itself is so often aligned with a more radical element, which I think does a little bit of a disservice to all of the women who didn't necessarily identify with the heterodoxy or free love or anything like that during Morgan's time. But they were 1,000% behind creating opportunities for women and getting behind them. So she never would have talked about it. So it was through her actions that she was showing what women could do, and she hired women and she trained women, etc. And she helped women build these institutions when they didn't have the money for it. So she was very much in support of them. And in terms of like interacting with the intelligentsia, you know, an artist, she knew some. Jessica Peixoto was probably the leading voice in intelligentsia that she worked with. They went to Paris together. She had a Ph.D. in sociology and was the first full professor, female professor at Berkeley. But, you know, Morgan worked a lot. I don't think she really liked to necessarily have long intellectual conversations. It's not really where her interests lay. So I don't have a strong sense of her going around with the women artists and intelligentsia.
Okay. Thank you. Ellen, how much time do we have? Can we do another question or two, or?
Yeah, I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Okay, yeah, I have a couple more in the chat. From Padma, he said, your discussion of how important it was for Morgan to prove herself through her knowledge of engineering materiality was fascinating. Can you say more about how the focus on early projects on engineering might have impacted the aesthetics or styles of her project? Did it change when she worked with other engineers?
That's an interesting question. That's a tough one. Honestly, I don't think I can really answer that one on my feet, just off the cuff. She was so focused on doing what the clients needed. Yeah, I can't answer that one really well off the cuff, to be honest.
Okay, let me go to the second one then. Related to that, can you say more about the unique aesthetics and redefinition of femininity in Morgan's work, especially in later projects? How does
Mhm.
what she's doing relate to the particular milieu of California versus Morgan's unique experiences and approach?
So that's a good question. So the Bay tradition style, it fell out of favor by the 1920s because Berkeley burned, the trees were all cut down, so it was expensive, and then LA was on the rise, and the whole more Spanish aesthetic was much more popular, the mission style. So that kind of fell out of favor. And then when you look at all the women's buildings, you see they're far more influenced by eclectic historicism. And so it's really important to understand each project in context, so that if you look at like the Riverside YWCA, it's not overtly masculine, feminine, like it's a mix of, it's got some California Monterey, it's got some Spanish revival, it's got some neoclassicism, it's eclectic. You can see the Beaux-Arts background. But then if you understand the story, where Frank Miller, he owned all the real estate, he like ran Riverside, and he donated the land for the site, and he demanded that the building be designed like the Mission Hotel, which is this over the top neo-colonial like mashup of Mission style, and that it should connect auditorium so that the serve the attendees at the auditorium. So he was defining women, they had to abide by his style, and they were going to be servants. And Julia Morgan helped the YWCA politely decline that plan and to build a completely separate structure, not attached to the auditorium. The women were independent that way, so you have independence. The structure grows incrementally as it moves away from the auditorium, so that it has its largest mass at the end and it stands out, which is the pool, which symbolizes so much freedom in women's lives in the 1920s. And so if you understand that, then that's where you understand the sort of underlying feminism of it, right? So there is a lot of context that helps to know, to understand. And I was talking a lot, so I don't remember the rest of the question.
No, I think that's great. Were there any other questions? I think we covered everything.
It looks like we have a few more popping in, but I also don't want to keep Karen too long with them. So I know, like you said, you could talk about Karen all night. I mean, about Julia Morgan all night. It looks like many in our audience can as well.
Two last questions that are quick. So is this recording of the lecture going to be available? I don't know if you normally share out the recordings.
It is available to people, yes. They can email me and I can get it to them.
Okay, and then as far as the exhibit, What Not to Miss, well, it's not a huge show, so I think you can make your way through and enjoy all of the artifacts, but we paired correspondence with drawings, I think, in an interesting way to give you more insight into Morgan's personality and her interactions with her clients. So definitely the correspondence aspect is pretty interesting, I think. So, and hopefully Karen will get to see it at some point.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Sorry, there was one last question about if you're trying to email to get the recording, it's eburkeo2@calpoly.edu. Just for the folks who wanted the recording.
Okay.
Thank you, Karen. This was wonderful. We'll do our silent round of Zoom applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.